It's working? Good.
Yes.
Sorry for the technical glitches. It seems like Catherine has some internet connection problems, and we had hoped that she walks us through the slides, but this should do as well. So, making bioenergy sustainable. I've welcomed you and wanted to now show a few slides about who we are. What is the Bioenergy Community of Practice? It's a peer-to-peer learning network that we have established in Latin America and the Caribbean. We do country deep dives. What are country deep dives? This is technical assistance in the area of bioenergy with individual governments in Latin America and the Caribbean. We bring mostly governmental representatives, but also those of a few experts, networks, working closely with those governments together on group-to-group learning, on peer-to-peer learning. Our members decide on what issues to advance bioenergy they want to put at the middle of those sessions, and then we're discussing this. We're trying to learn from best practices, most importantly from the region, but also bringing in our global knowledge through the Let's GP. And last and final, then we're producing knowledge products and disseminate these knowledge products regionally and globally. We're in our 4th year already. We started in 2016. In the first year, we were really very broadly approaching the issue with the membering governments, looking into how to advance bioelectricity. In the second year, we were looking particularly into de-risking questions. What are barriers to investments to bioelectricity, and what can be done about them? In the third year, we looked particularly into biogas and looked into how to create a policy and market environment for the sustainable use of biogas. And now in our 4th year, we have undergone a relaunch and are not just looking into bioelectricity anymore, but more broadly into bioenergy. And this year's topic is particularly how to integrate it into climate and energy policies, how to make it sustainable is today's topic, and that fits quite well with our work program for this year. Here are some of the activities. I mentioned technical assistance to BioECOP members already. Just as one example, we've just started to work with the government of Colombia on an analysis of investment risks to bioenergy, and this will hopefully ultimately lead towards the design of policies and finance instruments to advance bioenergy. We do almost monthly online sessions such as the one today to disseminate information, bring in some renowned speakers to speak about innovative technologies, policies, business models, and the use of tools. We do also face-to-face training sessions, not as often as these online sessions, but once in a while, where we will work on concrete tools and help our members learn how to use them. We do structured discussion sessions with the BioECOP core group, and we develop knowledge products that we develop. All of this is our activities of a quite ambitious work plan for this year. If you are interested in joining the BioECOP, please send an email message to Catherine Bocanegra. You see her contacts here on the slide. You can also contact us through the Let's Slack website, or get in touch with Ana Maria Majano, who you heard before was opening this session, who's the co-chair of this working group, or to myself. With this, a few slides to just lead us into the issue. They come from a presentation that I've given at COP25 in Madrid on the sustainable use of bioenergy, and also the role that bioenergy can play to address the climate issue. I think it's fair to say that we have come a long way from the traditional use of bioenergy, such as in using wood to make fire. Today's uses are multifold, of course. The feedstock comes from many different sources. It is processed in a broad range of different production processes to produce several biofuels, which then can be used for transportation, for electricity, for heat, for cogeneration. And of course, biomass is also an important source for materials and products. This slide, I have to apologize, urgently needs an update. Maybe Gernot can help us with it. This shows the growth of bioenergy between 2008 and 2015. And just within these 2 years, bioenergy has doubled in some sectors, particularly bioenergy use, the use of modern bioenergy for electricity. Bioenergy for heat has slightly increased, but biofuels for transport has also seen an enormous growth rate, and I would expect that these numbers have well continued over the last few years. Maybe Gernot can say a word about this if he has up-to-date numbers. Bioenergy, of course, is a double-edged sword. What we see here is a picture of a bioenergy plantation. You see a bit of a monoculture here, I would argue, and this has, of course, produced also some relatively bad news for bioenergy, using energy crops for producing energy rather than using plantations for food or cutting down very biodiverse systems for creating these massive monoculture bioenergy plantations. But it's also very clear to say that bioenergy can produce a lot of benefits. And I'm not going through this in detail now, but these are just some of the benefits of providing energy access, Sustainable Development Goal 7, affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy, from human health to educational benefits to the reduction of local pollutants if it's being used correctly. And of course, the big elephant in the room these days, aside from this terrible pandemic that we are facing, is climate change. Bioenergy can help to mitigate climate change. It can be a more sustainable use of our resources. Here you see a terrible plastic waste area, and help us to use our resources more efficiently and move towards a circular economy. So these were just some slides to lead us into the discussion. I'm really looking forward to introducing to you Professor Klepper. Gernot Klepper is a senior researcher at the Kiel Institute für Weltwirtschaft, IFW, or in English, Institute for the World Economy. He also coordinates the dialogue on the economics of climate change. He is an economist by training with a PhD in agricultural economics at the University of Kentucky. He has headed the Kiel Earth Institute. For many years, he has been head of the Research Center Global Commons and Climate Policy. And currently, he's also the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and chairman of the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Association. And this last one, certification from a sustainability perspective, is very much at the center of his talk today. Professor Klepper, we're very happy to have you. I'm looking forward to your presentation in the next about 25 minutes, and then we should still have ample time left till the full hour, or a little bit over the full hour, for questions and answers. Thank you. Professor Klepper, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. Good morning, everybody. I'm trying to share my screen now, and then I can begin my presentation. You probably don't see it yet. Okay.
I just made you a presenter. Can you?
Thank you.
No. Yes.
Yes. Here we go.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to the bioenergy community of practice today. bioenergy is an important part of our future energy system, but it's only really a good system if the bioenergy is produced sustainably. So what I want to do today is first go through the conceptual aspects of sustainable bioenergy and place it in the context of this sustainability dialogue and this sustainability debate. Then I will show you an example of how to put sustainable bioenergy into practice, and I draw this example, as Alexander mentioned, from the certification system Iscc. And finally, of course, I'm happy to answer your questions and go into more detail on issues that you might find interesting. Let me start with a background. Now, bioenergy is a very complex system, and the major reason, I think, is bioenergy is made from biomass. And biomass is one of the scarcest resources that we have on Earth. And it's used in so many different ways, as you can see here from those pictures, as food, as energy source, as industrial material. So that is an issue that we need to look at very carefully when we talk about sustainable bioenergy. And finally, it's also important for our global ecosystem. So looking at bioenergy requires to look at the other issues as well. And that means we need to look at the trade-offs between different biomass uses in order to determine which forms and which quantity of bioenergy is still sustainable supply. There are many people that say, well, there's lots of biomass in the Earth. And let me just go through a very quick account of what kind of biomass we have. If you look at this graph, you see that the above ground current NPP, which is the net primary production of biomass on the Earth, is a huge number, and it's counted here in energy units in exajoule. And you see it's more than 1,200 exajoule per year is produced on the Earth in terms of biomass. And that is more or less constant over time. It varies a little bit, but it's more or less constant. However, only a very small part of that biomass is harvested, and you see that down a little further down. And this is harvested as crops, as crop residues, as by animals, as grazed biomass, and of course as wood removals. The rest of that biomass, of that total net primary production, is essentially unused, and there are good reasons for it. One is it's not accessible. Second is it's not profitable. And the third is that it serves very important ecosystem functions. So if we go to the use of harvested biomass, we see that most of it actually is going into feed. So it's for grazing and as residues. And the other parts go to food and wood use, which is energy use, and some other uses. And if you go down to the final biomass use, you find that a large part, of course, is food for humans, but another large part is also for bioenergy already. And if we can go a step further and look at this, and I apologize for the German words here on this slide, I didn't have time to translate all of them, but this slide shows you which areas on the Earth produce which type of biomass and how it is used. And I don't go through all the details, but you see there are in the middle three major types. One is food in the top, in the middle with the green circle you see the bioenergy, and on the bottom you see the industrial use of biomass. Now on the left-hand side you see the agriculture in yellow, pasture in green, forests in dark green, and then unused areas on the Earth that are commercially available. Now, if you look at the bioenergy part, where it comes today predominantly still from forests. And that essentially, the reason is that it's used for traditional bioenergy use. And I'll talk about it a bit later. That's probably not the way we want to use bioenergy, because it's inefficient and we have better uses for it. So we have here a system where most of the bioenergy that we are consuming is still from forests, and the growing part of the more modern bioenergy that Alexander was talking about a few minutes ago, that comes mainly from cropland, and that is not reflected in the size of the area that goes into bioenergy products. Now, coming to the question of how we need to deal with the sustainability of such bioenergy products. There are so many trade-offs you can look at, and I just want to mention a few of them that more or less give you the frame of in which we need to talk about sustainability of bioenergy. There are the direct trade-offs I already mentioned, the trade-off between food and fuel or bioenergy, the trade-off between ecosystem functions that Alexander showed you, the plantation, and then there is a growing demand for fiber uses, not only in the traditional way for building houses and furniture, but also in the chemical industry and in other industries. And then, of course, we can reduce those trade-offs by using alternative sources like residues and waste. And you've seen in the chart before that there's quite a bit of residues and waste that can be used. There are some indirect effects that one needs to look at when the issue is expanding bioenergy production. It comes as biomass from rural areas. So we need to look at rural development. We need to look at objectives of land, overall land use, of landscapes and so on. And of course, we need to look at the distributional effects. If you convert, for example, a traditional agricultural area into bioenergy plantations, there are distributional effects that one needs to take care of. And there, of course, are welfare aspects of increasing bioenergy uses, income. Does the bioenergy activity reduce poverty, or does it increase poverty in some parts of the population? And finally, of course, the ecological aspects are important to look at. I'll come to that in a second as well. And that's biodiversity, but it's also the carbon sinks in forests, in peatland. There are areas on the Earth where we have a lot of bioenergy production that comes from peatland, and that is not essentially a good way of producing bioenergy. Now, if you want to look at sustainable bioenergy, the best framework that we have today and the best guiding framework is, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda of the UN. These 17 goals set the standard against which one can check whether these trade-offs by expanding bioenergy are worthwhile, or whether one should be more careful. I won't go through all of them, but I circled some of them in green and some of them in red in order to show these, when you do bioenergy, when you produce bioenergy, you not necessarily automatically meet all these SDGs. There are trade-offs to be looked at. One of the most obvious, of course, is SDG 2, zero hunger. The trade-off between food and energy is an important one. I just want to mention SDGs 14 and 15, which are more or less ecosystem SDGs. They also need to be looked at very carefully. Now, in order to do that, you need a system and a measure in which you can look at these different aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals and see how bioenergy can play its role within these different goals. And in order to do that, I want to show you how this has been brought into practice with the certification system that essentially gives the guidelines and the rules in which you can determine whether a certain bioenergy activity meets most of these goals and is supportive of the SDGs. And I want to do this with one example of a certification system. There are several more, of course, but this one is the one I know best, and I have of course, I'm a little bit biased, but I must say I think it's one of the best certification systems as well. But that's my personal bias. So I want to go through the Iscc example for practical introduction of sustainability certification of global supply chains. And the basic idea of Iscc is that we have 6 principles that a producer needs to meet in order to get a certificate as having a sustainable production in the bioenergy supply chain. And I quickly go through these principles. Principle 1 is, of course, an ecological principle and the climate principle, protection of biodiverse and carbon-rich areas. Nobody is allowed to destroy biodiversity or destroy large carbon stocks, other than a producer cannot get certified. Second principle, good agricultural practice, that the agriculture is used efficiently and in line with ecological principles. Principle 3 is a social principle, safe working conditions, that the activities on the farm mostly, but also in conversion plants are safe. Principle 4 is an important one, a very important one in many countries, that is compliance with human, labor, and land rights. So no violation of those rights is allowed if there is some evidence that these rights are not met, then there will be no certification. Principle 5, compliance with laws and international treaties. That also includes, for example, the Paris Agreement or the SDGs. Sorry. And finally, principle 6, good management practices and good continuous improvement. That's a very important one. Over time, the processes should become better and improve over time because nobody is perfect. Now, if you take these 6 principles and you can translate them to the SDGs, and here you see just a small setup of how these SDGs fit into the principles, and each principle has for the certification a checklist which each company has to check, and the auditor check the statements of these companies. And then you can see that how these 17 SDGs, or most of the SDGs, are included in the 6 principles of the certification system. Now, doing certification is not only on the farm. You have to look at the whole supply chain, and that goes from the farm or the plantation to the first gathering points, as they are officially called, the collecting points, then to the processing units. There's always transport in between, to the warehouses, and finally to the final market. All these steps in the supply chain need to meet the sustainability requirements, otherwise the final product cannot be claimed as sustainable. Now, this is a very general approach, and you can use it, of course, for many things. I just want to give you an idea of where we use it currently. There are so many crops and forestry products that can be used currently. It's the most important ones, of course, are soy, rapeseed, palm oil, sugarcane, but also sunflower, other cereals, cotton, wood, all these can be used, and they have different aspects once you look into them in terms of their sustainability. Just take an example, using wood is of course coming from forests. Then you have to see whether wood actually is the use of wood is a contribution to climate protection, or whether it destroys more carbon stocks than it saves by replacing fossil fuels. Now these crops, most of these crops have been come into discussion and were opposed on many grounds by NGOs, for example, because many of them are in conflict with food demand, and therefore there has been a long and very intensive search for alternatives, and technologies have been developed that have given much more feedstock to the bioenergy market than like 4, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. We now have a lot of feedstocks that do not conflict with food production or with ecosystem functions, and those are UCO, which is the used cooking oil. There's landfill gas that can be used. Tall oils are waste products in many industrial processes. There are tires that can be certified for the production of bioenergy. And then, of course, waste, plastic waste, crude glycerin is also a product that is in ample supply. But there are also the forest issues, husks, straw, residues, but not the trees, because they usually don't have a good carbon balance. And then, of course, there are increasingly coming to the market competitive non-bio feedstocks, and that's power to gas, power to liquid, CO2 as a feedstock. So the range of products that can be used for the production of bioenergy has expanded. And if one wants to see what are the most sustainable bioenergy products, those, of course, have a big advantage towards the other products because they are waste and residue, so they have not much use otherwise. And they support, and Alexander has mentioned it in his introduction, they support a circular economy, so they can be used after some products have been turned into waste. They can be turned into a feedstock again and then used for energy purposes. Now the question, of course, is once you have such a system, and once you can determine the trade-offs, and you can determine which of the products are sustainable in terms of social aspects, in terms of ecological aspects, in terms of saving greenhouse gas emissions, then of course you have to see how does it work, how successful can it become. And that is essentially a function of the support for certification. Now, there are many ways in which certification works. One, of course, is that companies are conscious of their sustainability challenges and require certification. There is an increasing number of companies that actually do it. There are also associations that support joint action to get it. There's encouragement by governments to move towards sustainable bioenergy uses. And finally, of course, there are also legislative proposals to make certification obligatory. We have one example that is in the EU with the Renewable Energy Directive. Bioenergy products in the European Union can only be supported by the European Union if they meet the sustainability requirements of the Renewable Energy Directive. So you have a complex system of support functions that I just list a few here that not only in the bioenergy market, but also in other biomass markets look and ask for certification. There are companies active in the food, in the feed market. There are industrial applications of biomass. And there are, of course, the energy applications, and several governments are supporting those certification activities. Now let me, before I end, come to the outlook for future sustainable bioenergy. In the next couple of years, of course, we will have a tremendous increase of demand for bioenergy products. That comes mainly from the airline industries, because with the IATA proposal to become carbon neutral in air transport, the demand for sustainable aviation fuels will be increasing tremendously over the next few years. And that, of course, is a huge market. It will probably even take some of the market in road transport, the bioenergy road transport away from the road into the air. But there's also another aspect that is important for technology development and for the different sourcing of the bioenergy products, and that's the long-term challenge of climate change. You probably know that in the long term, the world economy needs to become carbon neutral. Now, carbon neutrality means that we have negative CO2 emissions, because some of the greenhouse gas emissions cannot be brought to zero. And how do you get negative emissions? By taking CO2 and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and putting them back into land or soils or the water, the oceans. In doing that, there is one established technology that one can use, and that's the so-called bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, the BECCS. That is, we already have a couple of plants that produce ethanol. They capture the CO2 from the ethanol plant, and then this CO2 is stored underground and left there. So these ethanol activities essentially produce negative emissions, because they take the biomass, make it into energy, which replaces fossil fuels, and they have no emissions because they take out the CO2 from the production process. These technologies require a very different setup and infrastructure for bioenergy production, and they can replace inefficient traditional bioenergy use, but this also requires a change in the structure of the industry. Now, let me come to the conclusion, because I've run over my time. I think I already just let me add a couple of lessons that one can learn from looking at sustainability of bioenergy. Bioenergy will play an increasingly important role in future energy markets and in greenhouse gas reduction. I mentioned the sustainable aviation fuels and BECCS. However, that only works if these bioenergy products meet sustainability requirements to become effective in meeting the different societal goals that are more or less laid out in the SDGs. Bioenergy is not only the farm, it is the entire supply chain that one needs to look at. So we have to have a system that is transparent and clearly states how the sustainable products go through the supply and the value chain. Latin America is one of the few continents which has large land resources and climatic conditions for above average greenhouse gas savings. I'll just give you an example. Ethanol from sugarcane is a very good example. Palm diesel is another one, but there are many more. Promoting and getting sustainable bioenergy always needs to look at the trade-offs between the different objectives, the ecological, the social, and the economic objectives. Without looking at that, it is not going to be a successful product. And certification in the bioenergy supply chain needs to be transparent and a cost-effective way. The certification needs to be done in a cost-effective way in order to establish a sustainable bioenergy sector. I can tell you that the certification of bioenergy supply chains is not a huge cost. It's very, very small. In the final energy product, it's far below 1% of the product value. So we are not talking about, a complex system that requires a lot of resources to get. And of course, governments play a crucial role in making certification effective and widespread. As long as it is only voluntary, only the good guys, so to speak, will go for sustainable bioenergy. But if it's supported by governments, in which way you can think of, then it's going to become a successful product. With that, I want to finish my presentation. Of course, I am happy to answer your questions, and I can give you some more information if you're interested in some particular aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gernot. This was amazing, very, very interesting thoughts and slides. And I think the certification of sustainable uses of bioenergy is a key issue. I want to give folks a little bit of time to collect their thoughts maybe and formulate their questions. Again, this session is in English today. We do alternate the bioenergy session, somewhat alternate between English and Spanish. I think we had more events in Spanish this year. This one is in English, but feel free to ask your questions in Spanish, and Ana Maria, I'm sure, will help me translate what I'm unable to. Hopefully my Spanish is good enough to translate to English. You have two opportunities to participate in this session. There is a chat sub-panel here on your right-hand side, which you might want to use to introduce yourself or comment on what you have heard. And then there's one that's called questions. And I see that Roberto Asofaifa from the Ministry of Agriculture in Costa Rica has already made use of the panel. I'm turning to these questions in a moment. If you have more, please punch them into the questions window right now. I want to start with one question I have for you, Gernot. In the use of the Iscc certification system, I'm not sure whether you are willing to pick winners and losers, but maybe you can tell us a little bit from your experience of really applying the Iscc. What bioenergy technologies would you consider to be leading the pack after applying these indicators? And maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience in Germany, I think, where you have been, and in Europe, where you have been most active. But I'm sure you have some knowledge also of Latin America and the Caribbean, and maybe you can include that into your answer. What would you think? Where should governments we're working with particularly look at? What do you think are some of the leading technologies and uses?
Okay, that's a complicated question. I think there is no simple ranking of those. You have to look at the different principles, and let me start with the climate issue, because bioenergy is essentially for replacing fossil fuels. So in terms of climate protection, the question is which biofuel has the strongest reduction in emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions. And there you can find a relatively easy ranking. The best one is sugarcane, ethanol from sugarcane by far. And if you do that together with carbon capture and sequestration and storage, then you are into negative emissions. So that's in terms of climate protection, that's the big winner. The other ones, for example, if you look in terms of area, I talked about the scarce fertile land resources. In terms of area, you can say palm is very good because it produces a lot of oil per hectare, and it has quite good greenhouse gas factors if it's done in a modern way. If you have methane capture and advanced technologies, then you can go very high, almost as high as ethanol in terms of climate protection. Now let me come to the social issues. Social issues are essentially the question of how companies treat their workers and how governments regulate the working conditions. And there, it's always a question not of the companies in themselves, but it's a question of the regulatory framework and of the consciousness of firms in their labor conditions. So you always need to combine those issues and see where your priorities are and where you want to do that. And in the Iscc system, we have two types of requirements. One is what we call major musts. Those are issues that are absolutely crucial. And if somebody doesn't meet those, there's no certification. For example, conversion of forests into crop production or into feedstock production is not allowed. Destruction of biodiversity areas is not allowed. Strong violations of labor laws is not allowed. Then there are minor musts, and those are the issues that are not that serious, but where a company can improve on, and after a year will be checked again, and then improve over time its activities. And what we can see in the experience we have is that in terms, for example, of the climate protection, the reduction potentials of the biofuels that are produced has increased tremendously over the last few years. And that's simply because there's incentives to do that. In Europe, for example, there's a quota, and the quota is counted on the energy, the greenhouse gas savings. And if you have large savings, you get a higher premium than if only small savings. So there are economic incentives to do that. You asked me also another question that I forgot to answer, the update on your graph on the biofuel markets. Biofuels are increasing tremendously in the last few years. First of all, because many countries have moved towards a quota system that requires a certain share of biofuels in the road transport market, and that has increased the use of bioenergy or of biofuels. In Europe, it's around 6%. Indonesia, for example, has a quota of 20%. I'm not sure whether they have reached that quota yet. But so there are many countries that have introduced quotas in order to move up the bioenergy market and get the fossil fuels at least partly out of the transport market. Then there are some airlines that are already starting, especially in Scandinavia, to require mixing of biofuels with the aircraft fuels, the aviation fuels. Does that answer your questions?
That does answer my question, Gerhard, and I see many more are coming in right now. We don't have a hard deadline or a hard finish time at the full hour on our side. So if we can go some 15 minutes over, if that's okay with you, Gerhard?
Fine, no problem.
Really would like to make use of having you with us because I think many of the questions we're receiving right now are quite interesting. And I want to maybe stay with the technology side for one more question and then move on to talk about the economics and policy issues as well. Rodrigo Jimenez is asking, from a climate perspective, which technologies do you see maybe entering the mainstream soon? Which ones can make the biggest dent? You mentioned ethanol, particularly in the combination with CCS. What other technologies do you're talking about the success over the last decade or even more? Give us maybe a few more thoughts just on technologies before we move on.
Okay, yeah. Ethanol and palm are so-called first-generation biofuels, and if we move towards more advanced, I don't want to call them second or third generation, let's call them advanced biofuels, there is, of course, a tremendous increase in the use of used cooking oil, and because that's relatively simple technology, and that is established in many countries, have a large increase. They have a very good climate balance because it's a waste product, and it can be done in more or less conventional conversion plants. If you go a little more into the future, we have a lot of investment coming up that uses waste products, plastic waste, even municipal waste, mixed waste. That's very much coming up in the US, where there's lots of investment going into that direction, because this waste is essentially has a negative price. If you take up the waste from a municipal, from a community, then they might even pay you for taking that waste. So that's commercially something that's going, probably in the next few years, going to become very important. It becomes more important and more complicated when we talk about forest products and forest residues, because there the technologies are not that well developed. There's many years of research trying to convert forest products into ethanol, but that's not, it's possible, but it's too expensive at the moment. So the big issues is used cooking oil, and of course that has limits, and then waste products, municipal waste and plastic waste, and that has still huge potential.
If we, I got to turn to Roberto's first question here. Roberto from the government of Costa Rica. He has asked several questions. One is the issue again of monocultures that has created a lot of bad reputation for bioenergy. I think you have showed the broad range of what we consider bioenergy today, including the use of used tires and really key components, key materials that can enter a circular economy process, which is far from these monocultures. But let's talk about them one more time, because they are so prominent in the general discussion. I think the attention has been mostly to palm oil or to sugar cane, and it's used in formerly very biodiverse areas such as rainforests, and I think that's something that a few of us would like to see into the future. But other areas where you would say biocrops, bioenergy crops, even in such things as monocultures, can be sustainable because they're grown in areas that do not have a high biodiversity as it is. You know, if I think about deserts, I'm not sure whether you can grow bioenergy crops in deserts, but you know, few people and few animals live in deserts, as beautiful as they are. Do you know, if you think about Latin America a little bit, I'm not sure whether you have traveled there. So do you see areas where large plantations for biocrops do make sense from a sustainability perspective?
Well, I think the question of monoculture is not one not a bioenergy issue. It's also a food issue. If you want to do industrial large scale agriculture, and my personal opinion is we need to do it in order to meet the food demand of the growing world population, you can apply the same argument for bioenergy products. So the question is not monoculture versus small-scale agriculture. The question is monoculture where and at what cost. And if you convert areas that have high biodiversity values or that have high carbon stocks, then it doesn't make sense. It's violating some other sustainability goals. But otherwise, I don't see why large-scale agriculture should not be used for energy products.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think that answers it quite well. Another question from Roberta goes towards the key aspects that are to be considered in the decision-making process. I think you have touched on economic, social, environmental indicators. That is very much at the center of the certification, but maybe we can move this question a little bit towards the organizational side of politics. You're very involved in German policy making, leading an association, having been repeatedly asked by the German government to participate in the decision making. How do you, I mean, this is such a complex challenge because it touches on so many different sectors: agriculture, energy, transport, industry. You mentioned labor and all the different things that are brought into this big puzzle, also through different sustainability lenses. What's your advice there? Who needs to sit at the table? How do you organize it? Do you have a best case example from Europe or worldwide where you think this has really worked well? This has actually really improved the political debate on particularly sustainability of bioenergy?
Well, there are many ways of going after this. I would like to give an example from Germany, because Germany was actually the first country that moved in the biofuel business towards the system that we have now in Europe. And in Germany, it started with the so-called Sustainability Ordinance, Nachhaltigkeitsverordnung, for those who understand German. Now, the trick, I think that was a very smart regulation, a very smart ordinance. The trick of it was we allow only biofuels that are sustainable into the system. Now, the requirements to prove sustainability is given to certification schemes. So the government needs only to establish what kinds of rules and indicators it wants the certification systems to look at. So there is no complex interaction and system that needs to be established by government regulation. It simply says, we want a sustainable product, and the criteria for sustainability are A to X. And then this is given to a voluntary system, and producers who want to supply in the market go to a certification system, say, okay, we can meet these requirements, and the certification system then looks at it, sends auditors to the companies, and then approves those. So in terms of the political process, I think that was a very smart move, because it moved all the requirements and the introduction into practice towards a market-based and company-based system, without having, so too many government regulations and detailed regulators looking in government regulators looking into actual practice of companies. And I think that's probably the best way. Actually, if you look at the sustainability requirements in East Asia for palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia, they go more or less the same way. They have a quota system, and then they have a sustainability ordinance that says these for having access to the quota, companies have to meet these sustainability requirements, and then they are approved by certification systems.
Walter Mauricio's question goes in the same direction. If a government wants to support certification and understands that it has an important role to play in terms of regulating bioenergy, what are the first steps in very practical senses? How do you usually advise them? How do you initiate such a process?
The process works as follows. A government decides they want to have a sustainable product, for example, a bioenergy product or a biofuel. Then they establish a set of broad criteria that this product needs to meet, or the supply chain needs to meet. And what happens in the European Union, for example, but also what happened in Germany before the European regulation came into place, they ask for proposals how this can be implemented in practice. So the certification schemes propose a set of checklists and criteria according to which, of course, should meet the rough criteria of the government. And they propose this checklist system to the government and the government looks at it and approves it or doesn't approve it. But if it approves, then this checklist will be used in order to meet the legal requirements that are set by the government. So the detailed work is given to the certification body, but is approved by the government.
Yeah, thank you. Are there international processes in place that support this process? I mean, you yourself are advising the German government. I think you're quite active beyond Germany as well. There's associations that are helping governments see this. Beyond that, particularly maybe if you look in the climate side, what's happening under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? Do you find that bioenergy receives the attention that it should receive there? Can you think of regional initiatives that you would like to particularly emphasize that are helping in this process, that are helping governments to see the opportunities that exist?
At the moment, I wouldn't say. I think my impression is that this is mostly a national activity, because national governments introduce those regulations. They are part of their climate strategy, but they are not included as a multilateral climate strategy, because in effect, I'm not even sure whether it's a good way of doing it, because the conditions are so diverse. If you compare, small-scale agriculture in some European countries towards large-scale agriculture in South America, or plantations in Asia, that the conditions are so different that national regulations actually need to make to take this place. In fact, the Iscc certification also has adjustments to the particular conditions of certain areas on the globe, in order to simply limit the work that needs to be done. For example, the compliance with good agricultural practices in Europe is not checked because it's a legal requirement, is controlled by the government anyway. Or there are some certain conditions that need to be checked in other areas because they are always met automatically. So these national approaches, I think, are quite good, and I don't see why they should have global coordination, because essentially what you want to look at is the greenhouse gas savings, and those are then going into multilateral activities, but not the activities how you get these greenhouse gas savings.
I think that answers Pablo Varela's question also from Venezuela. How do we ramp this up? The clock is ticking. So you would say that the attention needs to be on the national decision-making process. Probably we would start with analysis of what resources are available, how they are best being used, and then use a certification system to really prove that that's
well. And in fact, I don't know the participants where they come from here, but my guess is that in all of these countries there is bioenergy production, and a large part of that is certified for specific circumstances. So the question I think that one needs to address is, can this improve? Can it be expanded? And for that, it would need government action and legal requirements to expand it under the control of sustainability requirements. But you want to increase bioenergy, and in order to get that, you need incentives to make it profitable. Because, I mean, one thing is sure, there are very few places in the world where bioenergy products are cheaper than fossil fuels, especially in these times where fossil fuels are extremely inexpensive. Prices have gone down in the last couple of years. So you need special government incentives to do this. It doesn't need to be a subsidy, but other incentives like quotas or carbon pricing could do the job as well.
I think that's a key question that every energy source and every application at every scale faces is entering a broader market. If we look into the energy market, of course there is no such thing as a free free market. Regulations play a key role for any technology. Can I ask you what most important barriers and risks to investments you see, and what are some of your favorite policies, regulatory tools, finance options to address those barriers?
I think the greatest risk often is government regulation, because it can be removed. So if you're talking about investment, long-term investment for 10, 20 years, the question is the current regulation a credible regulation? Will it stay in place? That, I think, is the biggest investment risk for participants. There are, of course, macroeconomic risks and challenges, and those are essentially that, going back to your first question on the ranking of these biofuels, those biofuels need to have substantial greenhouse gas savings, or bioenergy products in general. So my suggestion would be, if you have a credible carbon pricing in a country, then this would be the guiding principle for investors, because they can see how the carbon price develops and how this carbon price changes the competitiveness of their bioenergy products vis-a-vis fossil fuels. The other challenges, risks, I think there are some, of course, for advanced technologies. There are some risks that we don't know whether they will be working or whether they actually get down the learning curve. And the forest products is one example where there have been many years of research and investment and pilot projects, and it's still too expensive and has not been successful so far.
Good, thank you very much. I think we only have 5 minutes left, so maybe we touch on a few questions in one. But first, to answer your question, you don't know who's on this call. I can tell you, I see names from Mexico to Uruguay, Costa Rica, Peru, Sri Lanka. So you
Wow.
have attracted quite
Jamaica.
international crowd. Yes, Anna Maria, why don't you come in?
Jamaica and Morocco also.
Wow.
Yes.
So yeah, maybe you know, folks seem to be very interested in again in sort of the technical side, and most importantly the feedstock side of things. So we have a question from Sri Lanka relating to the use of rice husk. We have a question concerning the use of algae, and we have a question, I'm not sure whether you're an expert on this, to use CO2 to generate energy. I'm not sure whether you have looked into the question in your research. So maybe we take these two, rice husk, CO2 and algae as a startup.
Okay, let's start with the algae. I think that's the easiest one. The energy balance of algae production, or of ethanol production, or oil production from algae is not very good, because algae are very wet, and in order to make them dry, you have to put quite a bit of energy in it. That's the main obstacle for algae. And there's also, of course, a cost effect in it. Rice is a complicated one. It's hardly used because, of course, there's lots of demand for rice as a food product. But there's also a problem with the rice production, because you have quite a bit of emissions in the rice production. And I don't have the numbers with me, but I would guess that the greenhouse gas emissions of rice production itself, in terms of the energy that you can get out of it, is not as good as in many other crops and feedstocks. But that's my guess. But because, you know, since you grow rice mostly on water and wet soils, there's always the issue with methane emissions, and methane is such a strong greenhouse gas. that may be a difficult issue. Similarly to palm, where if you don't have methane capture, you can forget the palm diesel. And finally, CO2. That's a really complicated one. CO2 is a very stable molecule. In order to convert it, you need a lot of energy again. And the basic issue in using CO2, the so-called carbon capture and use, CCUS, the basic issue there is, where do you get the energy from in order to convert CO2 into another molecule that can be used as a fuel? And the issue there is, if you get that energy from a renewable source, it's fine, because then you get the carbon and you can produce carbohydrates. But if that comes from a fossil source, then the carbon balance is already gone again. So CCU, carbon capture and use, only makes sense if there's lots of renewable energy. There are some processes, the Lanzatec process, that does this, and they have been received quite a bit of government support and investment funds. But let's put it this way: it's not a huge greenhouse gas savings that you get by using CO2 as a feedstock. You avoid getting it into the air, but you also have to put a lot of energy into it in order to make it into carbohydrates.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your assessment of algae as being costly and energy intense. I want to mention that in the beginning of this year, and all of our recordings are of these sessions are online, we looked into the particular area of algae, and there energy use of algae was rather a side product, and the main benefit of using algae was to clean rivers. In that particular business model, in this particular case, and algae was also being used as a feedstock for animals, for example, and bioenergy just made one component in a larger cost-benefit assessment.
Mm-hmm. But that's one of the issues that is coming up over and over again. That is, if you use it as a residue, then you're quite fine, because you have different uses that are valuable by itself. If you use it as a sole product, it often is not really valuable as a bioenergy product.
Yeah. Last question, and then I would say we will address the remaining questions that we haven't addressed as a follow-up to this webinar. Maybe we can collect them and send them to you in a digestible manner, okay. And you can at least point to some reports or so where our participants can follow up and intensify their research of this area. So maybe one final question is how we've talked about governments a lot, we've talked about policies a lot, what can they do, and they are sort of the core group of the community of practice. But if we look into industry, how can we get industry more interested in this whole issue area? It seems to be a challenge for them to really understand the issues. I mean, the interest will raise with regulation when it starts to hurt, or when it starts to create opportunities, of course. But yeah, what do you think is industry's broader role in this, and how can they be made more interested in bioenergy?
Well, industry is pretty broad. Actually, there are very different interests. You have for example, the chemical industry is not, of course, not interested in bioenergy. They are interested in biomass that they can use for all kinds of purposes. So you have to be very careful in looking at what type of industry you're talking about. In the energy industry, I think it's an established activity. Even the majors, the oil majors, are going into this area. There's lots of investment going into bioenergy technologies as soon as there is a business opportunity and a business case for doing it. And the last 2, 3, 4 years have shown an increasing interest simply because, my guess, investors are expecting that there will be a large demand from the airline industries for sustainable aviation fuels, and they expect that these companies will pay prices that are higher than those that are currently paid for biofuels.
Again, it was my mistake. I wasn't very precise here, but Pablo Varela actually was in posing his question, and he was speaking particularly about the agricultural sector, and was speaking particularly into the high investment costs that are needed upfront to benefit from the use of bioenergy. He's asking particularly whether you are aware of any regional or international bilateral financing programs that can help reduce those upfront investment costs, or there's all sorts of sovereign funds, of course, that help you insure against currency risk and all the many macroeconomic risks that you also mentioned. Which are the most prominent ones that you think government should look into?
Well, I'm not sure whether there are many programs, because the bioenergy issue itself is quite controversial, especially in the development community in terms of development aid, because of the conflict with smallholders and so on. I think the issue is more one between large and small agricultural companies and farms, and if you are in industrial agriculture, the investment for bioenergy production is not really an issue. That bigger companies can do that, and they do it frequently. For smaller farmers, it depends on the product and the technology that you're using. That may be a challenge in the palm oil business. With the smallholders, it's organized in one way, but in general, I would say bioenergy is not the real thing for small farmers. I mean, this is an industrial product, and I mentioned at the end that we need, if we want to do BECCS, you need very large scale activities. So if you want to have negative emissions, so the overall bioenergy business in the future will go much more towards large scale activities, and the food production may remain in the family farms. But I don't think that family farms have a good chance of going into the modern bioenergy activities.
Yeah. Thank you, Gernot. Thank you so much. I'm going to give Anna Maria the word in just a moment to also thank you, and I'm not sure whether she has any more guidance for our members regarding next sessions and so on and so forth, but I very much enjoyed the conversation with you. This was really excellent, exciting, good new insights for me, and I'm sure for our members as well, and our broader audience that joined this call. We had very good participation. There's a few more questions that haven't been addressed. We've said already we hope to follow up with you individually. I want to thank Catherine Boccanegra for helping organize this session, and then with this, again, thank you, Gernot. Thank you to all participants. Over to you, Anna Maria.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Klepper. It's been really great to have all your knowledge and experience shared with our community of practice. I would just like to thank the participants and let them know that the materials from this session, both the recording of the session and Dr. Klepper's presentation, is going to be available in the webpage of the community of practice, and that we have 2 sessions scheduled for the rest of the year. So please, we are going to send you the information. If you're not part of our mailing list, or you're not a member of the community of practice, please write to Catherine Boccanegra, We will ask you a few questions and include you as a member of the community of practice. Thank you very much, Dr. Klepper. Thank you, Alex, for your facilitation of this session, and have a great day and a great week.
You're welcome, and stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.